All right, welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion's 2022 Fall Lecture Series, The End of the University. My name is David DeCosimo, and I'm director of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion and associate professor in BU School of Theology. The Institute was founded over 50 years ago by a group of philosophers, theologians, and scholars of religion who wanted to carry forward the tradition of personalism that had been definitive for the study of philosophy and religion at Boston University, and that had been instrumental to and central in the formation of their student, the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., as he was pursuing a PhD in systematic theology at Boston University. The driving force, though, behind the foundation and formation of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion was an Italian kid from the North End who'd found his way to Boston University and had himself done a PhD here and had fallen in love with the life of the mind. And this same man, Peter Bertucci, was the teacher of Dr. King in a 2-semester-long course on Hegel, in which they attempted to read all of Hegel's works chronologically. Bertucci gave Dr. King a B+ on his final paper, and perhaps that's why he found himself at Dr. King's dissertation defense, sitting not in the chair, but as a mere committee member on the side. But the affection between the two men was great, so that in 1956, in the February, after an attempt on Dr. King and his family's life had been made, Dr. Bertucci would write a letter to King assuring him of his prayers and encouraging him in his ongoing fight for justice. And it would mean enough to Dr. King that he would save it, and it would become part of his papers. In 1970, Bertucci was concerned about the direction in which he saw both philosophy and the university heading. He was worried about an encroaching hyper-specialization that crowded out the fundamental kinds of human questions that had been so central to his own falling in love with the life of the mind. And he wanted to secure an enduring foothold at Boston University where those questions could continue to be answered. He wanted, on the one hand, to inherit the great strengths of the analytic approach to philosophy, defined by rigor, conceptual acuity, care in constructing arguments and answering to objections on the one hand, and to bring that together on the other hand with the existentialist concern for caring about and inquiring into the most important things. And for 50 years, the Institute for Philosophy and Religion has attempted to be a site for those kinds of questions to be asked. At the heart of the Institute is a commitment to explore with the utmost rigor and in the best company fundamental human questions about the most important things. It seeks to maintain a space amidst hyper-specialization and hyper-politicization, where questions that lead human beings to philosophy, religion, and theology in the first place can continue to be asked. And that brings us to the topic for this lecture series, The End of the University, which is an attempt over the next several months to ask whether the university can continue to be a place and what it would take for it to continue to be a place for these kinds of questions to be answered. The end of the university, both in the sense of the purpose and goal and aim of this institution, but also the end of the university in terms of asking whether this institution can endure and exploring the relationship between those two questions. Our distinguished lecturer today, I can hardly think of anyone better to inaugurate the series than Professor Glenn Loury. Professor Loury is Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences at Brown University. He received his PhD in economics from MIT and was tenured in the economics department at Harvard University at just 33, an age when most of us mortals are still trying to finish our dissertations. After a decade at Harvard, he spent nearly 15 years as a professor here at BU, where he founded and directed another BU institute, the Institute for Race and Social Division. Dr. Loury is the author of dozens of seminal articles in economics across multiple subfields. He's the author of widely acclaimed award-winning books, including One by One from the Inside Out and The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, a distinguished fellow of the American Economics Association, a member of the American Philosophical Society, a recipient of the John von Neumann Award, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Carnegie Scholarship winner. I could go on and on with his distinguished record. But alongside all of this, Professor Loury is also an incisive, creative, and relentlessly fair-minded critic and commentator on matters of culture, race, and politics, most famously for many as the host of the extremely popular podcast, The Glenn Show. Somehow, Professor Loury has managed to do the impossible, to be an extraordinarily serious scholar, an economist, while also at the same time distinguishing himself as one of the leading public intellectuals of our time. Yet none of this, to my mind, quite captures what I believe is most remarkable about our speaker today. On the one hand, that's his extraordinary intellectual honesty, a willingness driven by love of truth to follow the argument where it leads and to ask the most difficult questions, not only of others, but of himself. And the story of his life bears witness to the depth and longevity of that commitment. And on the other hand, his courageous and steadfast refusal to recite the scripted lines or play the ready-made role, and instead, his daring and humane courage to be that most difficult of things, an individual. Please join me in welcoming Professor Loury for his lecture, Why Does Racial Inequality Persist?
Thank you, David. That was a very generous and flattering introduction. I'm very grateful for it. Can everybody hear me? I'll get a little bit closer to the mic. Is that better? Okay. Well, I've got a text, and I'm going to share it with you, and then we'll open for questions. And brace yourselves. This lecture proceeds in two parts. First, I will critique the conventional wisdom widely embraced in today's elite academy about the sources of persisting racial inequality in America. Then I will give voice to my concerns about how these institutions pursue racial diversity and inclusion in their own ranks. Both parts of this talk will take the position that thinking about these matters in elite higher education circles is badly off-key and in need of comprehensive revision. Part one, a candid account of persisting racial economic disparities. Why, I ask, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, has the unequal economic status of Black Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this difficult problem requires that we distinguish between the role played by anti-Black discrimination, past and present, on the one hand, and the role of behavioral patterns to be found among some Blacks on the other. Now, I admit this puts a very sensitive issue starkly. I willingly acknowledge that anti-Black biases exist and join with others to insist they be remedied. But I also think it is imperative to identify and address ourselves to the behavior patterns that prevent some Black people from seizing newly opened opportunities. In recent writing, I have recast these two positions as causal narratives. What I call the bias narrative argues that the root cause of persisting disparity is found in anti-Black racism. You're all familiar with that. This is the view most encountered on campus these days. Discrimination causes racial inequality, so we must reform society to achieve a level playing field. The focus here is on the demand side of the labor market. Such reforms are necessary but not sufficient, in my view. By contrast, the view which I would emphasize today, the development narrative, is concerned with how people acquire the skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster their successful participation in society. Its focus is on the supply side of the labor market. Its premise is that those who lack the experiences are not exposed to the influences and do not have access to the resources that foster and facilitate their human development. Those will, in general, fail to achieve their full human potential. Now, of course, obviously, these two narratives, bias versus development, are not mutually exclusive. What is clear, however, is that they point in very different directions in terms of intervention and remedy. This tension between a focus on demand side versus supply side factors to account for racial disparities is a very old theme for me. It's what led me to coin the term social capital in my doctoral dissertation at MIT in 1976. In doing so, I was contrasting that concept, social capital, with the more familiar notion of human capital. As you may know, human capital theory studies inequality via a conceptual framework that was initially developed to explain investment decisions by firms and that focused on formal economic transactions. I thought and think this framework was not adequate when applied to explaining persistent racial economic disparities. I believe my concerns from nearly 50 years ago remain relevant today. I'll take a moment here to explore these ideas more fully. My basic point in that thesis was that associating business with human investments is merely an analogy, not an identity, particularly when thinking about persisting racial disparity. Business investments are transactional. Human investments, I argue, are essentially relational. Important things are overlooked in the human capital approach, things having to do with informal social relations. Conventional theory was incomplete when accounting for racial disparities, I argued, and there are two central aspects to this incompleteness which led me to make two basic observations which I intend to share with you now. One about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the nature of racial identity. I wish to reiterate these observations because they remain relevant. First, my first observation was that all human development is socially situated and mediated. The development of human beings occurs inside social institutions. It is dialogic. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. Think about language acquisition, for example. The family, the community, the school, the peer group. It's inside of these cultural institutions of human association where human development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance. Such resources are not alienable. Developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, networks of connections between people create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. This is important for an economist. The market is not the medium by which human development occurs. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. People are not machines. Their productivity, which is to say, their behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, these things are not merely the result of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, such capacities are the byproducts of social interaction mediated by human affiliation and connectivity. This is fundamentally important, I think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That's the first point I was making all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. The persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups in an open society where people live in close proximity to one another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation in that society. For there would be no races in the steady state of any dynamic social system unless, on a daily basis, and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid assiduous attention to the boundaries separating themselves from racially distinct others. This is so because over time, race would cease to exist unless people were acting so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this second sociological point. We speak so casually nowadays about race, racial equality, racial justice, and yet race is not given in nature. It is socially produced. It's something we are making. That there exist distinct races is an equilibrium outcome, not a fact given in nature. Race is endogenous. It follows that if the goal is to understand the roots of durable racial inequality in any society, we must examine in some detail the processes causing race to persist as a fact in that society, because almost certainly such processes will not be unrelated to the allocation amongst individuals of human developmental resources. Here then is my second observation in a nutshell. We economists need to recognize the limits of our tools to account for durable economic disparities by race. The creation and reproduction of such inequality ultimately rest on cultural conceptions that people hold about their identities, about the desirability and the legitimacy of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others. And here I do not only mean sexual relations, although I do mean that too. Racial inequality is not just a disparity of material resources, I'm saying. Most fundamentally, it's rooted in the decisions that all of us, of all races, are making about with whom to associate and with whom to identify. Such, anyway, was the gist of my argument. The contrast I drew in that doctoral thesis all those years ago between human and social capital was grounded in my conviction that decisions of this kind about with whom to associate and identify determine the access people enjoy to those informal resources they require to develop their full human potential. What I was calling social capital when I coined that term in 1976 is, on this view, an essential prerequisite for the creation of what economists routinely refer to as human capital. And we economists know, and there's plenty of data to support this claim, that human capital, a person's skills, education, work experience, and social aptitudes is a key determinant of a person's earnings power and capacity to generate and to accumulate wealth. Social capital theory is an extension of human capital theory. The resources people need for their development are not all commodities acquired in markets as the result of transactions. Some of those resources are embedded in a person's social situation, that is, the resources of a mother's attention to her health, for example, when a child is in her womb, the resource of peers with whom one associates, and the things that they valorize, which then become important things shaping the choices a person makes about the acquisition of skills, the resource of information about what is possible to achieve that results from one's connections to other people who have already explored those possibilities. These and a myriad other things that I could name are also factors or inputs into skills production. But these things are not commodities. So a financial deficit does not fully capture a deficit of these things. This was the idea I wanted to employ to give an account of durable racial inequality, even after, hypothetically, all discrimination was eliminated. The inequality would still persist, I argued. I wrote that dissertation in the mid-1970s, just a decade beyond the big civil rights laws and quite early in this era of relatively fair market opportunities for people irrespective of race, an era which I would argue we do now inhabit today. The post-civil rights era is now almost a half century old. It's more than a half century old, depending on when you start counting. I'm not saying things are perfect in terms of racial equality of treatment. I know they are not, obviously. But it is a relatively level playing field now in terms of the market's evaluation of skills. So the question before us is whether the disparities that history has produced for Black people will necessarily wither away under this new dispensation, and my answer is no, they needn't. Because formal transactions in labor, credit, housing, and other markets are not the whole show. Also important are informal interactions with one's peers in neighborhoods and communities, given the structure of families, the nature of prevailing values, the norms and notions of identity that inhabit a mind. Those to whom one is connected, who one can call upon, who influences a person, who informs a person. These things matter. Books in the home matter. Whether the children are read to, whether parents turn off the television set, and so forth and so on. My social capital concept is a tool for thinking about inequality and its remedies. It disciplines us to appreciate the limits of anti-racism regulations in a world where developmental outcomes depend on market processes. You did not hear me say I was against anti-racism regulations. What I said was such regulations will in general be insufficient to get the job done of remedying the persisting racial disparities. I am not saying that people without money have no need of it. Rather, I'm saying that often money is not the only thing they need. Talking in this way, I must insist, is not blaming the victim. Oppressed groups, time and again, evolve notions of identity that cut against the mainstream. A culture can develop among them, inhibiting youngsters from taking those actions which are necessary to develop their talent. Now, I ask, do kids in a segregated, dysfunctional peer group simply have the wrong utility functions? That's economics speak for are they simply looking at the world the wrong way? It's a mistake to attribute the dysfunctional behavior of some among an historically oppressed group of people to their simply having the wrong preferences if those preferences have emerged from a set of historical experiences that reflect the society's larger structures and activities. And yet, by the same token, it is a grievous error to ignore the consequences of such behavior or to pretend it doesn't exist, as too many anti-racism advocates are doing. Behavioral issues affecting Black communities are real and must be faced squarely if one is to grasp why racial disparities persist. Self-evidently, the young men who are killing each other on the mean streets of St. Louis and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Chicago and so on ad nauseum are behaving abominably. Those bearing the cost of such behavior are mainly other Black people. An ideology ascribing that behavior to structural racism is a bluff. It cannot be taken seriously by serious people. Nobody believes it, not really. Or consider educational test score data. Anti-racism advocates are in effect daring you to say that some groups are represented at elite universities in outside numbers compared to other groups because their academic preparation is magnitudes higher and better and finer. They're daring you to notice that such excellence is an achievement. One is not born knowing these things. One acquires that knowledge through effort. Why some youngsters have acquired skills which others have not acquired is a deep and interesting question, and I'm prepared to entertain it at length. But the simple retort, racism, is laughable, as if such disparities have nothing to do with behavior, with culture, with what communities and peer groups value, with how people spend their time, with what they identify as being critical to their own self-respect. Can we get serious here for a minute? People do not drop from the sky with 800 SAT scores. They earn them. Asians are said sardonically to be a model minority. Well, as a matter of fact, a compelling case can be made that culture is critical to their success. Don't take my word for it. Read Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou's book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox. These Asian sociologists interviewed families in Southern California trying to understand how their kids got into Dartmouth and Columbia and Cornell with such high rates. What they find is that these families do, in fact, exhibit patterns, embrace values, adopt practices, engage in behaviors, and follow disciplines that orient them so as to facilitate the achievements of their children. It defies common sense, as well as the evidence, to assert that they do not, or conversely, to assert that the paucity of African Americans performing at the very top of the intellectual spectrum, I'm talking here about academic excellence and about the relatively low numbers of blacks who exhibit it, has nothing to do with the behavior of black people, that this outcome is entirely the product of institutional forces. Frankly, that claim is an absurdity. I maintain, again, that nobody really believes it. Neither does anybody believe that 70% of African American babies being born to a woman without a husband is A, a good thing, or B, due to anti-black racism. People say it, but they don't believe it. They're bluffing. They're daring you to observe that the 21st century failures of many African Americans to take advantage of the opportunities created by the 20th century's revolution of civil rights are palpable and damning. And yet these failures are denied at every turn. This, I regret to say, is not a tenable position. The end of Jim Crow and the advent of equal rights for blacks was a game changer. That now, a half century down the line from this, we still face these disparities is shameful. The plain fact of the matter is that much of the responsibility for this sorry state of affairs lies with the behavior of black people ourselves, a fact that the anti-racism crusaders in today's elite academy refuse to acknowledge. I take no pleasure in saying it, but I say it nonetheless. What is more, there is a deep irony in first declaring white America to be systemically and essentially racist, and then mounting a campaign to demand that America recognize its racism and deliver us blacks from its consequences. I want to say to these advocates, if indeed you're right that your oppressors are racist, why would you expect them to respond to a moral appeal? You're in effect putting yourself at the mercy of a court while simultaneously decrying that court to be biased against you. This idea is disempowering in the extreme, and moreover, for a philosophy colloquium, more importantly, it's incoherent. I now turn to part 2 of this talk, explaining what's wrong with racial affirmative action in higher education. I begin the second part of my lecture with a provocation. In my view, affirmative action in American elite higher education is not even about equality. It's about covering ass. Let me explain. In saying this, I want to draw your attention to the difference between a university's interest to admit a diverse student body on the one hand, and the long-term interest, rightly understood, of a population that may be the beneficiaries of such largesse. My point is that genuine equality is not the same thing as titular equality. Substantive equality is not the same thing as optics equality. Equality of respect, honor, dignity, and standing, equality of achievement and mastery. These are not the same things as statistical parity among demographic populations. True equality of respect, the only kind worthy of the name, is distinct from today's popular sloganeering that celebrates diversity, equity, and inclusion. for what are euphemistically referred to as historically underrepresented groups, which, by the way, and transparently, is a phrase that is simply avoiding saying for non-white people who do not perform well on standardized tests. An affirmative action policy that entails the permanent lowering of standards and academic qualifications for admitting Black applicants into a competitive academic venue is, ironically, not even really an egalitarian policy at all. To the contrary, it can be a patronizing and dishonest end run around the very difficult task of developing the full human potential of all of our people. As we stand here a half century past the institutionalizing of selective, as we stand here a half century past the advent of racial preferences in higher education, I'm urging that we think carefully before institutionalizing and making permanent selection methods that rely on racially differential standards of academic assessment. I urge us to consider that while such a system can equalize representation, it is in fact not consistent over the longer term with achieving genuine equality of respect. Now, I set this argument within a historical context. A half century ago, Black Americans emerging from Jim Crow segregation and widespread discrimination had, as a matter of fact, been impeded in terms of developing our competitive and productive capacities. Education was not equal in 1930, nor in 1950, nor in 1970 for that matter for Blacks and whites, nor is it equal today. There were negative consequences of discrimination in employment, of segregated residential neighborhoods, and of differences in school quality for young people. These disparities impeded development within the Black population of our innate potential for academic performance. These effects are visible in American society even to this day. Given such a history, one cannot expect that at day one there would have been equality of test scores or other measures of achievement, since background conditions did not afford Blacks an equal chance to realize our full human potential. Granted, understood, I got it. That was the status quo ante from which affirmative action emerged a half century ago. The baseline from which we endeavor to move forward towards something more equal. Such were the conditions in which the routine deployment of racial preferences in selective college admissions emerged. That was a difficult historical challenge, but we are now at a crossroads. We are not in 1970 anymore. We're in the year 2022. We need to step back and reevaluate what we're doing. I am not here, I don't want to be misunderstood, objecting to affirmative action in principle. I'm not declaring that it's unjust racial discrimination in reverse. I'm not holding that it violates the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That is not my argument. As an historical matter, in the transition from the status quo ante of exclusion, one can see that it was both necessary and proper to rely upon some preferential methods as a stopgap mechanism. Sandra Day O'Connor said over 20 years ago, she hoped, or nearly 20 years ago, she hoped that we wouldn't be doing this 25 years from when she spoke. Well, we're nearly 25 years from then, and we're headed in the other direction. But it is treating the symptoms of Black underdevelopment, not curing the disease. Affirmative action is treating symptoms, not curing a disease. It's not actually developing people. It is shifting the standards of assessment on behalf of demographic goals while avoiding the hard work of actually developing their human potential. I don't doubt for a minute, if it needs to be said, that we have the human potential to compete on a level playing field with any population. I do hold, however, that in significant parts of the Black American community, that potential is not being fully developed, and that is the problem. At the end of the day, we must address the fundamental developmental deficits that impede the ability of African Americans to compete in larger numbers in these most competitive and selective academic venues. But rather than doing this, we've settled into a second best remedy using lower standards for Black applicants. It's a profound error. It's a mistake. I'm arguing that to use preferences to cover the consequences of our racially unjust history is an error. It's cheap grace for elite higher education. And ultimately, black people will be the ones left with the short end of this deal. The permanent reliance on preferences by race to select elites invites patronization, condescension, contempt, dishonesty, shame, and the erosion of standards in those selective venues where the competition for status is most keen. It ain't worth it. I am not here concerned with any particular mechanisms of selection. If you don't like the SAT score, okay. If you prefer to use letters of recommendation and high school GPA and so forth when deciding who gets into college, okay. But whatever the mechanisms of selection that are being used, they should be applied in the same way for selecting black Americans as anybody else. Otherwise, the end result will fall short of genuine equality. And that is not my opinion. It's not even an ethical argument. It's a statistical necessity. My point is that there will surely be post-selection differences in the performance of students by race if one insists on using different pre-selection criteria when choosing students, so long as those criteria are actually correlated with post-admissions performance. If the selection criteria, standardized test scores, earlier grades, advanced placement, enrollment, quality of writing, or whatever indicia of qualifications that you want to use, if those things are not correlated with performance, then they shouldn't be used at all for anybody to select admittees, especially if they have a disparate impact on a historically disadvantaged group. But such criteria have been used precisely because, as we all know, all of us professors know, they are in fact correlated, not causally determinative of, but correlated, related to post-admissions performance. The context matters, of course. For graduate education in STEM fields, we'd be talking about the GREQ. For undergraduate education in liberal arts, we might be talking about the SAT verbal. In either case, though, the relevant assessment criteria are correlated with post-selection performance. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using them to discriminate amongst white kids. Now, we insist on using different cutoffs by race with a vengeance. That's the regime that we're in. That's what I'm complaining about. That's what I'm arguing against. That's where the universities are going wrong, in my opinion. You just need to take a look at the data produced in Discovery in the Harvard affirmative action case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, a case that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court in the coming term. This is not that kind of talk. I'm not going to put up a slide with the data on them, but they're easy to find. Search Peter Arcidiacono. He's the economist at Duke, who's the expert witness for the Students for Fair Admissions side of that case. And he's got tables, and you can see quantitatively exactly what I'm talking about. There are huge disparities in the indicia of academic preparation characteristic of students being admitted to Harvard University by race. And that's just one example. And we only know about the details of it because of a lawsuit. Transparency in such matters is rare among selective colleges and universities. I wonder why. These are large samples. If the pre-admissions criteria correlate with post-admissions performance and you've got enough people and you've got a big enough difference in the pre-admissions criteria between racial groups, you're going to get differences on the average in post-admissions performance. It's not my opinion. What is the consequence of that? Remember, this is selective. We're in the right tail of the human population. We're not at the median. We're not talking about the average kid. We're talking about exceptional kids. We're selecting elites. The consequence of using racial preferences to promote representation of the disadvantaged in venues of high selectivity is either that we acknowledge the unavoidable post-admissions performance disparities by race, or we cover them up by flattening our post-selection performance assessment criteria. That is to say, We either humiliate those being preferred or we pretend that the predictable consequences of racial preferences don't exist. This dishonesty can be stifling. My claim is that right-tail selection plus racially preferential selection is ultimately simply inconsistent with true racial equality. It'll get you representation, but it will not get you true equality. That is, an equality of dignity, of standing, of respect. The latter ultimately depends on something approximating an equality of performance. It should be clear that different average performance by race in a highly competitive elite setting is something to be avoided. We cannot pretend that it doesn't exist. We can. We can pretend that it doesn't exist. We can look the other way. We can grade inflate. We can formulate various institutional responses to the fact of racially preferential and racially preferential selection and racially differential performance. We can do that in our competitive venues. We can live with this result, especially since the beneficiaries are a relatively small part of an institution's overall student body. But in doing so, have we really created a just society? What I'm trying to get at here is that we should be concerned about the quality of racial equality, about the distinction between counting people by race while saying that we're diverse and inclusive, on the one hand, and on the other hand, developing the capacities for performance of our young people who belong to historically disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. People are going to accuse me here of stigmatizing students of color who benefit from affirmative action because I point to post-admissions performance differences by race as a grounds for concern. That is a red herring. Recall, I'm talking about selection of elites when I distinguish between ass-covering representation and substantive equality. I'm not talking about the selection in the fat part of the human population. Those selected are taken to be exceptional performers. The honor conveyed to them comes from the distinction of being identified as one of those young people in society who truly excel, who are capable of extraordinary achievement, who are in the top 5 or 10%. Thus, Brown University, where I teach, admits 1,800 out of an applicant pool of 35,000. Likewise at Harvard. The fact of having been selected is meant to convey that you've been vetted, compared to others, and found to be an outstanding prospect among your peers. Do we really want to undertake such an enterprise on separate tracks for racial groups, not as a transitory remedial intervention in a time of crisis, but as a way of doing business going forward? I think not. Peter Arcidiacono, whom I've mentioned, an economist who was expert witness for plaintiffs in the Harvard affirmative action case that's headed to the Supreme Court, has studied students at Duke who elect upon entering to pursue science, engineering, and mathematics-type curricula. He wanted to know how likely it is that students abandon their ambition to study in the technical curriculum and switch over to less quantitative lines of study as a function of the student's race and pre-admissions characteristics like their test scores and prior grades. Using data on Duke undergraduates, he found that more than half of the Black students in his sample who began at Duke intending to pursue STEM area studies ended up switching out before graduation, compared to fewer than 10% of white students in the same situation. But he also found that once controlling for their test scores and grades prior to admission to Duke, there was no racial disparity whatsoever in the probability of leaving STEM. What this data from Duke indicates, this is somewhat anecdotal, but it's indicative of the kind of problem that I'm talking about, is that the Black students interested in STEM but with lower technical qualifications in their pre-admissions profile were simply unable to persist in their study of the technical curriculum. Is such a result consistent with genuine equality of respect and standing? I ask. Let me give another example. I've actually been told this on more than one occasion, sotto voce, by law firm partners in New York and Chicago, that for optics' sake, they hire associates of color, some of whom they don't believe are all that good. And they know that, again, for optics' sake, Some of those hired are going to have to be made partner because the firm can't stand the reputational hit of having a class of partners with too few non-whites in it. And without wanting to be quoted by name, they say to me, I shudder at that prospect, yet the logic of affirmative action compels this. And now we're confronted at the firm with an ex post facto situation in which everybody knows that there are these disparities by race in the performance of our young associates, but nobody is willing to say so, since it's politically incorrect and professionally ruinous to do so. Affirmative action in 1980? That's one thing. Taking that as a year of marking the transition from the era of discrimination to an era of aggressive efforts at achieving diversity and inclusion. However, affirmative action as the institutionalized and ongoing use of differentiated standards by race when selecting amongst applicants who compete for highly valued positions, that's another thing altogether. If equality of respect is what you're interested in, the latter is extremely problematic. Let me now consider some possible rebuttal to my argument. Putting aside race for a moment, it is the fact that an elite college also gives preference to people from underrepresented parts of the country, like Idaho, since they don't want all their students to come from Massachusetts or New York, so-called geographic diversity. Moreover, at a place like Harvard, acceptance rates for legacy applicants and children of alumni is much higher than the general admissions rates. So, Professor Loury, my critic might continue, you say that fake equality impairs the certification of honor and excellence by employing different standards for Black people. Doesn't that objection also apply to geographic diversity, and doesn't it apply in spades when thinking about legacy preferences? My response to that criticism is as follows. When thinking about the relationship between equal representation and equal respect, we must consider background conditions under which various groups that we can identify, legacies, athletes, those with rural backgrounds, Blacks, et cetera, are operating. True, rich kids with 3 generations of Harvard alums in the family who get admitted ought to have an asterisk next to their name. They got into Harvard perhaps only because their father bought their way in. This is a kind of blemish, I agree, and it should be a kind of blemish. Rational inference based on everything that we know means that the fact of selection would convey for such persons not the same information when it's common knowledge that the person got that kind of an advantage. But beneficiaries of legacy preferences cannot be identified at a glance. It may be that they can live with that asterisk in a way that someone like me, and this is a personal assertion, every African American might not affirm it, would not be prepared to live with. Unfortunately, we Black Americans have something to prove in such venues. There is a shadow of doubt covering us, precisely because of the history of race and racism. This means that people begin with the supposition, many, that we're not good enough. We often have to show that we are. I don't think that's fair. I agree. But I argue, given the background historical conditions in which we find ourselves, it is unavoidable. People know that we're coming in with all these disadvantages, and are faced with the need to demonstrate through our performance that we've actually overcome them. I can also see the argument that gatekeepers to elite institutions like Harvard, Princeton, or Brown might make, that they need to have some people of color coming through their winnowing process. Bowen and Bach, the former presidents, respectively, of Princeton and Harvard University, whose book, The Shape of the River, was published in the late 1990s, makes an argument of that kind. They say that society as a whole has a profound interest in having within its stratified elites representative numbers of Black people to sustain the legitimacy of institutions and to facilitate the smooth operation of a diverse society. So I see there's something to that, and maybe some affirmative action is justified in that means, but nothing like what we're doing. Again, I invite you to look at the Harvard data. I'm not, however, advocating color blindness here as a moral principle. I actually would subscribe to the argument that the law professor Randall Kennedy makes in his book, For Discrimination, which I recommend to you. He says, look, I acknowledge that this is racial discrimination that we're engaging in when we do affirmative action, but it's not racial discrimination that should be precluded by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This is Randall Kennedy, but I sign on to that argument. He then gives the functional argument about why you might want to do something like this in the interest of society, as Bowen and Bach also do. But the question is constantly, to what extent? Again, I invite you to look at the data. We're way overboard. So my concern about affirmative action doesn't go all the way down. My concerns are not fundamental ethical objections. Rather, they are me asking, what kind of world do we want to live in 2050? Do we want to be in this business of giving racial preferences for selection at right tail inhabiting institutions for African Americans as a permanent way of doing business? And as you know from my argument to this point, I think not. There's an alternative, I would argue, and we should be pursuing it. Direct societal attention at the underlying structures generating these differences in performance. That is, if we want there to be more black physicists, more black literary critics, or more black economists, then we should do something about the educational dynamic that produces such huge disparities in pre-selection performance by race on those criteria that are used to select students at elite institutions. The stakes here are enormously high. Racially preferential treatment in elite higher education normalizes a way of thinking about race, about equality, and about equity that has far-reaching implications. Simply put, there are some kinds of goods which cannot be redistributed because the act of redistribution, the very act, undermines the quality of the good. Human distinction is one such good. This is a cry from the heart here. Don't patronize my people. Don't judge us by a different standard. Don't insult us with a soft bigotry of low expectations. This is my plea with gatekeepers at elite institutions. Pull back from the brink. I don't know that it's even an argument as much as it is an expression of sentiment at this point, though there is certainly some logic behind it. The consequences of American history have left us facing a huge project of developing the human potential of African American people in our society. The legacy of our ignoble past is partly reflected in deficiencies or inadequacies of performance, so that the relative numbers of African Americans excelling at certain kinds of rarefied intellectual pursuits is low. Taking the long view of history, the only viable solution to that historical inheritance is a focus on enhancing the capacities of Black people to perform. That's a huge, multi-dimensional, decades-long project. Institutional reliance on racial preferences diverts us from that necessary task. Now, I understand, and I'll conclude, I know I'm going on for a bit. I understand that those running an elite university don't have control over venues of human interaction where development takes place. I know that. Indeed, they govern only a small sliver at the back end of a long process of development. They don't control primary and secondary education. They don't control preschool education, and they don't influence family life, peer group culture, and the extent of economic disadvantage that impedes many young people. Some of them are not Black or brown. Some of them are white. Many young people from greater academic achievement. They don't control the federal budget supporting low-income families and so forth. So there's only so much that those decision makers can do. But from a societal point of view, the challenge before us is to bring this segment of our population to a point where it's able to fully realize its potential, which has to some degree been stunted by history. And I want this to be done in a way that doesn't patronize that population and that doesn't abandon our standards of excellence. As I've said, we're now in the year 2022. As I've said, we're more than a half century past the advent of affirmative action. We need to take stock. We need to be serious about assessing the consequences of what we have done. And when I venture down that road, I have doubts. Again, let me not mince words. The goal should be equality. The long-term goal of what we do in the aftermath of our ignoble history should be creating a circumstance of equal dignity, respect, standing, and status across racial groups. We are a long way from doing that. Institutionalizing the practice of preferential affirmative action when assessing African Americans for selection into highly competitive arenas using different standards when judging the fitness of African Americans who are competing with others for access to selective and elite venues, making that an ongoing way of doing business is inconsistent with the goal of racial equality. It invites us to become liars. It invites us to pretend that things are true which are not true. It invites us to look the other way. I repeat myself, it is patronizing. It is undignified. Let me say it again. Knowing that I'm being judged by standards that are different and less rigorous in virtue of the fact that my ancestors suffered some indignity is undignified. It's patronizing. It's not equality. It's the opposite of equality. Fair treatment for all, regardless of their identities, is what we should strive for, not parity of group representation. This general point applies beyond the historical context of race in the United States. And I will conclude here. There's a fatal contradiction at the heart of the argument for group equality of social outcomes. In my considered opinion, we ought not to expect this, and we ought not to make achieving it our goal. Equality of opportunity, not equality of results, is the only defensible public goal in my view. The dogged pursuit of equal results between racial groups across all venues of human endeavor, frankly, is a formula for tyranny and more racism. Here's why. Identity-based arguments for group equality posit that we have different groups. We have Jews, we have South Asians, East Asians, we have blacks, we have Latinos, and so forth. And that these groups have identities which deserve to be acknowledged and respected. No cultural appropriation here. When someone tells me I identify as a member of Group X, I'm given to understand that this is a part of their personhood, which warrants to be respected and given credence. So, groups are fundamental building blocks of society in this identity-focused view of the world. It's not a matter of indifference. We're in these various boxes. Groups matter. A group's culture and its heritage matter to its members. The music listened to, the food eaten, the literature read, the stories told, the narratives repeated from generation to generation. All of these things for the identitarian are important, and they vary across groups. And yet, on the other hand, group egalitarians presuppose that absent injustice, there'd be equality of groups across every human enterprise. But how can that be? Because if groups matter, some people are going to bounce a basketball 100,000 times a month, and other people are going to bounce it 10,000 times a month. Some people are going to be drawn to books as a way of experiencing human culture, and other people are going to be more given to verbal and spontaneous expression, or whatever it might be. There are differences between groups. Groups matter, after all. They're not all the same. They don't do the same things. They don't believe the same things. They don't think the same things. They don't spend their time in the same way. So now, I have population groups that have their own integrity, expressing themselves in how they live their lives, how they raise their children, how they spend their time. Inevitably, this will result in different representation of the group's members across various human activities. The various group's members will not all be involved in academic pursuits, in the business world, in the professions, or in sports and entertainment to the exact same statistical extent. They will not have the same occupational and professional profiles. If groupness matters for the identitarians, then this groupness must ultimately be reflected to some degree in how people choose to live their lives. How then can these egalitarians insist that society is unfair unless it yields an equal proportionate representation of these groups in every human enterprise? This is simply a logical contradiction. Acting in a determined way on that contradiction can only lead to tyranny, to disappointment, to conflict, and to more racism. For if we try to erase those cultural and behavioral distinctions that constitute the substance of groupness, if we put everybody into one social milieu, override the autonomy of parents, socialize child rearing, and so on, well, then we might be able to flatten the terrain enough to achieve some kind of equality of groups in every human pursuit. But to do this would be tyrannical. It would extinguish our freedom as individual persons to associate with each other, to believe and to live as we please. And should such a draconian policy fail to produce group equality, as seems more than likely, we'd end up with the question, how come there's so many Jews or Asians or whites or whatever in medical school with PhDs in electrical engineering at the top of the income distribution? That is where identity-based group egalitarianism leads. There is no end to the quest for group equality if indeed group identities are meaningful and persistent. The presumption of group equality in the face of group distinctions of social organization, culture, and values leads either, as I've said, to a tyrannical imposition of uniform standards by force in a vain attempt to tamp down the authentic expressions of groupness, or to endless finger-pointing and suspicion whenever some group of people move ahead or fall behind the pack in this or that arena of achievement. A treacherous presumption will haunt society that any disparity must reflect some systemic unfairness. That is a formula for perpetual conflict, not for social justice. It's a temptation that should be resisted. Thank you.